All right, thank you all for coming today. I'm Walt Stocky, Research Director of the Institute for Virtual Environments and Computer Games, which is hosting the event along with Film and Media Studies. Peter will be introducing Michael and the talk. So just in case none of you know about the Institute, we're an organized research unit, campus-wide. We have over 50 faculty affiliates in almost all the schools on campus. So we have from humanities, people in film and media studies, and history, and other departments, School of the Arts, School of Engineering, Information Computer Science, Social Science, Ecology, Medicine, oh yeah, those guys too, Education. Physical education is the one that we don't yet have. Is anybody here from PE? Okay, but they have talked to us about doing some games for sports. So, all right, so if you have any questions about the Institute, feel free to contact me. Magda Elzarki is in the back, who's the director of the Institute. So we're here, we welcome you, and I'll turn it over to Peter to introduce Michael.
Thank you. And I'm glad that we can do this on this side of campus occasionally to instantiate interdisciplinary nature and make it easier for people from the School of the Arts to walk over here. So without a lot of ado, it's great to have Michael Mateas back on campus. As you can see here from the slides, he's taken on too many hats to mention. On the Santa Cruz campus, he earned his PhD in computer science at Carnegie Mellon, where Simon Penny used to be, who can't be here today, unfortunately. And now he's in the news. He and his colleagues are in the news because they're starting a new program in computational media. So as a leader in computationally focused design and analysis approaches to playable media, he's been named the founding chair of a new department there with proposals for a PhD program and other ambitious plans at our sister campus, where they also have a Center for Games and Playable Media. So in the spirit of friendly competition and collaboration within the same university, please help me welcome Michael Mateas.
Great, thank you. I'm happy to come down here. It's been too long since I've visited Irvine, so hope to be back for other visits. So in this talk, what I want to do is the first 5 minutes or so will be kind of a brief overview of just structurally what we're doing at Santa Cruz, like who are the faculty, who's in the new department, where are other games-oriented faculty, where are they in the university. Then I want to sort of dive into what we mean by computational media. And I'm going to do that by first kind of trying to connect the dots from, well, we have this games program. What's the relationship between games and computational media? And then I'll try to connect the dots between different disciplines and how different disciplines relate in the context of several specific example research projects. So just to give a sense of programmatically in terms of game or playable media oriented degree programs, at Santa Cruz, there's 5 that are sort of currently operating. Within the Baskin School of Engineering, which is in 2006 is when we started the BS in game design, which is a sort of technically oriented degree program, similar in flavor to the BS that you guys have here. Since then, we, among the set of us who do work in games and playable media, supervise a bunch of PhD students who are earning PhDs in computer science, but are doing a games and playable media focus. And to that end, we've developed a whole bunch of graduate courses that PhD students in CS would take if they're doing research in that area. A couple of years ago, we also started a professional master's in games and playable media that actually runs out of our Silicon Valley campus. On the arts side of the house, because we also collaborate a lot with the arts, you can earn an MFA in digital arts and new media from the Dannon program, which is organized into these things called project studios, or kind of project clusters, and one of the 3 is playable media. And so every year we have a number of students who are coming in and earning an MFA in DANM, specifically focused in playable media. And Noah Wardrop-Fruin, my colleague who also directs the Expressive Intelligence Studio with me, he and I sort of direct that project studio and integrate those students with the PhD students in the Expressive Intelligence Studio. But again, there have been sort of MFA-oriented games and playable media courses for these people. And then we've actually got a new BA in game design that is launching next fall. And that has its own separate curriculum. We've been working with the arts division to help them figure out what would be in that BA. And in fact, we've also just done a big overhaul of the BS with this joint cohort model, where the BS students and the BA students actually take sort of a shared set of freshman courses and are kind of coming together. Then there's sort of a splitting out, and then there's a coming back together for a year-long project studio in their last year. So that's just sort of curricularly what we currently have. We're also, as a Department of Computational Media, a newly founded department, putting in this year our MS and PhD proposal for MS and PhDs in computational media specifically. And so that'll be a new kind of graduate degree you can earn. That, of course, has to go through, Oakland and all of that review. So we're, knock on wood, that'll be starting in 2016, 2017.
Just quickly.
Yeah.
So what does that do to the PhD program? Are they competing or?
So what I think would happen, I can say for Expressive Intelligence Studio specifically, I'm guessing that our steady state in the future would be that so we have 15 PhD students within Noah and my research group. I'm guessing in the future 2/3 of them would probably be earning PhDs in computational media, but I think there's still a third who are going to want to, both because of the sort of their research focus, but also the kinds of jobs they want to get afterwards, the kind of academic positions they will want to earn a degree in computer science. So I would see us moving forward still working with computer science PhD students as well, but yeah, the balance will shift once. And of course, the comp media degree has like a different set of core course requirements and so forth than computer science. Faculty-wise, these are the founding faculty of the new Department of Computational Media. So Jim, he actually earned his PhD here at Irvine, so I'm guessing a number of you may know him. And his focus area is software engineering and games. Sri Kurniawan does work at the sort of intersection of HCI and playable media, particularly around games and assistive technologies. So rehabilitation games and games in the assistive technology space. Arnav Jala's focus is computational cinematography. Lynn Walker does work in dialogue and natural language, and we'll be actually looking at one of the projects that she was one of the PIs on in the group, and you'll see some of the flavor of her work, but we're looking at, and she's looking at how to apply NLP technologies in the context of expressive domains, expressively interactive, artwork, autonomous characters, and so on. And then Noah Wardrop-Fruin works in playable media, interactive storytelling, and software studies, and myself. Working in a number of areas. So this is the founding faculty in computational media, but we also have 2 research faculty that are part of the computational media department. Dan Shapiro, who does work in cognitive architectures and interactive media, and he used to run a group called ISLE at Stanford with Pat Langley before moving to Santa Cruz. And then Brenda Laurel, who I think is, most of you probably know, very well known for her work in, first actually inventing the term interactive drama, which is one of my core research areas, and also her work in VR. And then on the professional MS side, we have John and Brenda Romero, who direct that. So, John Romero is the co-founder of id Software and designer and engineer on Doom and Quake. So that's, what he's well known for, but, has done, worked in the game industry a long time, has many credits. And Brenda Romero is, has worked for years in RPG design, but also in the last several years, like 5-6 years, has an art practice making board games, like Train being one that's famous, but a number of sort of board games that comment on socio-political and historical issues. So they co-run our professional MS in games and playable media. This is currently an intense one-year degree that we really want to expand to 2. Like the students, it's too intense as a one-year degree. So we're sort of in the process now of some proposals to expand it to a 2-year degree. And this really is professional training for commercial development. So, this is a very kind of, industry placement oriented program. And it assumes a technical foundation for anyone coming into it. We also have the Center for Games and Playable Media, which, like the center here, is kind of an umbrella for faculty across campus who have work that overlaps with interests in games, but where games might not be their core area, and kind of brings them together to present sort of a unified face to industry, to do projects together, to organize events. We've had this Inventing the Future of Games symposia that we've held a couple of times that they've organized and so forth. And then on the arts side, there's 4 faculty currently whose sort of primary focus is in games and playable media, and and arts will be actually recruiting a couple of more, 2 or 3 more over the next few years. So Warren Sack, who a number of you may know, and he's also involved in the new computational media department, though his primary home is film and digital media. Mike Chemers is in the theater department. Dramaturgy and interactive media is sort of his focus. Comes to us from Carnegie Mellon, where he was applying dramaturgical principles to the design of scripts for human-robot interaction. So sort of has a lot of interest in that. Susanna Ruiz and Robin Huneke are 2 new people who just joined us this year. Susanna really interested in documentary gaming and civic media. Back when she was at USC as a graduate student there, she developed a game called Darfur is Dying that got a lot of attention as in this sort of emerging form of documentary media. And then Robin Huneke was a producer on Journey, the game that sort of swept industry awards a number of years ago, and is also just sort of a very prominent voice in game design and sort of pushing new genres and approaches in game design within the game industry. So that's kind of the brief, the fast overview of sort of programmatically and sort of faculty-wise where we are right now with games at Santa Cruz. What I want to spend the rest of the talk focusing on now is more in a sort of substantive content-based way, like what is computational media, what is this new department doing, and what is kind of the research vision for what we're doing. So in the computational media department, our primary research activities, which in any one project are often undertaken in combination, are developing computational design approaches that enable new forms of media. So this means like, inventing new algorithms, new architectures, new approaches to authoring computational content that enables media forms that you just couldn't even think of building now, right? That would be too laborious or just kind of impossible to conceive of given current computational tools. So it's sort of like, in a sense, inventing new kinds of architectures, computational architectures, to enable new forms of media. That's one of our activities. Then making novel computationally driven media, actually releasing experimental games or making interactive artwork and having gallery shows, doing, in a sense, cashing out the new computational approaches by actually making media with them. And of course, the act of making media with them pushes back hard on the requirements for the new computational infrastructure, right? It turns out that when you actually try to make media with things, many of the presuppositions when you were first designing a new computational approach turn out to be wrong. And only by sort of riding that feedback loop of media creation and sort of computational innovation can you converge on something that is useful. And then finally, studying the creation and function of computationally driven forms of media from technical, historical, and cultural perspectives. So this includes sort of, software studies, science and technology studies view of computational media, applying algorithmic techniques to data produced by people interacting with computational media, right, in order to sort of understand their interactions and visualize their interactions better. So these are the three primary activities, research activities, I should say, and research interests of the computational media department. In the rest of this talk, I want to first link up, what does this have to do with games, right? Like, why didn't we call this the games department or something? What is, if we've got this games degree, why did we create this thing called computational media? So I want to kind of build that bridge, and then through a series of examples of specific projects, show how multiple fields come together as kind of an interdisciplinary practice. So, if we look at the kind of state of game design, contemporary game design, today's games are kind of lovingly handcrafted, and that loving handcrafting is actually what creates the powerful experience, that players want to give themselves over to, right? And what does it mean when I say lovingly handcrafted? Well, things like models and animations are handcrafted. Stories are handcrafted. And here we see a bunch of choose-your-own-adventure novels, and I think we're all familiar with that form where you're given explicit choice points and you turn to specific pages. And we see an example here. So you've got your choices. If you say, "I'll do it," turn to page 4. If you say, "No thanks," turn to page 6, given a setup for this adventure. And the story progressions in contemporary games are similarly handcrafted. And in fact, in many games, aren't even branching. They're basically linear with sort of a set of lock and key mechanics to constrain the linear movement. And then the gameplay challenges are all orthogonal to the story progression. So the gameplay challenges are running, jumping, climbing, shooting, etc. And then those gameplay challenges sort of appear or are layered on top of a linearly scripted story. Language and dialogue are handcrafted. And so, here we see a standard kind of dialogue tree editor. Levels and challenges are handcrafted. So the progressions in games are handcrafted. So kind of a starting point for moving from games into computational media is to observe that wherever there's handcrafted content in a game, it's limiting the player's agency. That the player, there's a sense in which wherever there's handcrafted content, it can't be put into play, right? That there isn't the ability to have a rich interactive loop between player decisions and the possibility space, because the possibility space has been kind of pre-mapped out and is channelizing the player into specific channels. And interestingly, this doesn't take advantage of the unique communicative potential of games. If we kind of think about what are games bringing to, there's many different media forms. What's unique to games as a media form? What are they bringing to the table that maybe we haven't seen before? And our claim would be that what they're bringing to the table is the ability to communicate through processes, where the process is the message, not the sort of static content. To get a handle on that, one way to do that is to look at Pong. I'll just go back to not the earliest, by any sense, video game, but one of the earlier video games. And so, here we see a Pong contest going on. So imagine in the case of Pong, if the dynamics of this game had been handcrafted in the way that all the other things we've been talking about have been handcrafted. Then you might end up with something like paper Pong. And you can Google paper Pong, by the way. It's actually someone created sort of 150 pages of this thing that you can play. And so here's a page in paper Pong. The ball's coming towards you. You can move up. Well, it's a little blurry here, but turn to page 33 to move the paddle up. Turn to page 121 to move the paddle down. So we're going to turn to page 121. Okay, well, the paddle moved down and the ball is closer. Now, tellingly, both up and down say turn to page 25. And I think we might know what's on that page, right? But we can see this feels sort of ludicrous that when we do this to Pong, right? That when we take the sort of fundamental interaction of the experience, the process that supports the experience, and pre-handcraft all its possibilities. Yet we do that with tons of other content spaces and games without thinking about it, right? And if we think about what Pong's doing, in some sense, Pong's got a little baby model of physics in it. So here we have, Isaac Newton being stuck in a cabinet, a Pong cabinet, but there's sort of a baby model of physics under the hood that's responding to, the angle at which the ball hits the paddle, where on the paddle it hits, and the speed with which the paddle's moving, and what direction it's moving when the ball hits it. That all determines the speed and angle with which the ball bounces off. And players, when they're playing this, are really, in a sense, experimenting with this process, right? They're developing an intuitive model of the physics of Pong in their head, and through a kind of creative exploration of the underlying process of Pong, becoming better and better players. So the message I take away from this is that, in some sense, the computational model is the message. Right? The underlying computational model. In the case of Pong, its message, that it's communicating, is really this kind of baby model of physics, and giving the player an opportunity through exploratory and playful interaction to develop their own kind of intuitive mental model of that underlying computational model. But what, in a sense, we're interested in computational media is saying that, like, well, every area of human endeavor we want to be able to build computational models of, not in the sense of we've got the right veridical model. This isn't about sort of realism. This is about building playable simulations that communicate effective and powerful experiences and messages to players, right? And so this notion of the computational model becoming the message is kind of the key twist where we move from games to computational media. But games are kind of the preeminent form that has started showing us that this is possible. Games are the form where their process orientation, the fact that they're fundamentally processes rather than collections of data that are being played back, is it's the form in which that's become most visible, right? There are precursors of it in other media forms, in other art practices. But games has really taken that and like turned the volume to 11, right? And so what we want to do is say, well, there's lots of kinds of experiences we can imagine making that aren't necessarily games, but for which the computational model is the message. And this is one way we distinguish this, I guess I would say, from first wave digital media. If we ask, like, how is computational media as a department and as an area different than digital media? There have been digital media programs for a long time. Well, I'd say the distinction is that digital media tends to, that collection of practices that calls themselves digital media tends to be data-centric rather than process-centric. And so, like a lot of sort of 80s era digital media work, for example, talked a lot about convergence. And you'd see these diagrams of like telephony, television, and computing, and it was all about that the Venn diagrams are moving together into a single circle, right? But this was very much a vision of what happens when you translate everything into the kind of lingua franca of bits. So it's all bits, and then you like manipulate the bits and play back the bits. That's kind of what the convergence message is, which is very much a data-centric message. So the difference between sort of, why we call this computational media versus digital media is that, again, we're focused on the process and the computational model being the message as opposed to the data. So if we think of, if we could compare computational media to other fundamentally new approaches that have come in computing. So the first one I want to look at is bioinformatics. So if we look at bioinformatics, you've got biology and you've got computing, but when you put them together, it's not the case that computing is sort of, a mere tool, quote unquote, to answer biological questions that the biologists were already asking themselves before they started working with computers, right? And it's not the case that that the computational work, the computational work isn't fully driven by the biological questions, and the biological questions aren't fully driven by what computers are capable of. Instead, the two in concert produce a new way of thinking about biology that gives rise to both new biological questions and new computer science research that just wouldn't have even been conceived of otherwise, right? Like this is not application. This is not the application of computing to biology. This is actually like a new interdiscipline where computer science is being changed and biology is being changed. Similarly, we feel that media plus computing gives rise to computational media, where when you sort of take being interested in media forms, from an arts and humanities perspective, and you take those questions seriously as first-class questions, and you take some computational questions seriously as first-class questions, guess what? You start asking and answering questions on both sides that you would not even have conceived of otherwise. So in the same sense that bioinformatics becomes sort of a new interdiscipline that fundamentally changes computing and biology, we feel that computational media becomes a new interdiscipline that fundamentally changes media and computing. All right, so let's try to cash that out a little bit by looking at three, I can't really call them disciplines, but collections of disciplines in the university, and how these three things kind of relate to each other in the context of some specific research projects. And I think that'll help make this even more concrete. Interestingly enough, in doing this kind of work, the sort of epistemologies and ontologies of these three collections of disciplines are fundamentally distinct, right? What counts for knowledge, how you tell whether you've got new knowledge or not, what counts as progress and measures of progress or validity are actually like really different between these three collections of disciplines. And so putting them together, sometimes I like to think of this as like big I interdisciplinary, right? Which is not to say that like small I interdisciplinary is not bad. If you're putting together chemistry and physics, that's great, and that gives rise to new things, which that particular interdisciplinary combination has already existed for a long time. But you don't have to actually cross the divide of different epistemologies and ontologies, right? So when you put different engineering disciplines together, or engineering with science, there's a sense in which it's not as, what's the right word? Because I don't want to be pejorative of small I interdisciplinary. That's powerful too, but it's just not as radical, basically, as actually having to renegotiate, like, what the hell is knowledge here? What does it mean to make progress? Those have to be renegotiated when you're crossing these kind of divides. So let's look at a particular, I'm first going to sort of walk through a particular project briefly. I'm only going to have like a few slides per project, because if people are interested just technically in any of the projects we've done, I'm happy in the discussion period to go into it and ad infinitum. But here I really want to just describe enough to then come back to this interdisciplinary relationship. So Spy Feet is a role-playing game with real-world movement intended to encourage and facilitate kind of outdoor activity for middle school age children. So you can think, you could call this a kind of exer game, but it's not, it's trying not to be heavy-handed and say like, do your exercise now, right? It's more intended to be the case that, hey, I'm enjoying playing this cool RPG on my phone that happens to be making use of geographical data in order to dynamically plot and plan RPG actions, quests, information, such that people move around a lot in the physical world while they play the game, right? So that's, and this is done by having the player basically discover a plot through information that they gather from multiple characters who each have their own character relationships, their own things they know, their own predispositions. You can try to befriend one character or become enemies with another character. But you're doing that by the characters, the virtual characters, being positioned virtually in physical space. And their positioning in physical space, plus the actions you've done beforehand, changes what they want to talk about and so forth. How do we, so first of all, this isn't going to work in a typical sort of pre-scripted quest structure because it has to be able to dynamically retarget the structures of the RPG onto a new set of geographical information, new locations, new characteristics of locations, and so on. And so any attempt to sort of, do the usual RPG design trope, which would be to kind of pre-script all the quests, put some subset of the quests on a linearly scripted main arc, and then all of the other ones are side quests that can be taken in any order because they don't actually materially contribute to the plot. You know, this would be the standard. Well, you can't do that if you're trying to dynamically retarget the RPG on real-world geographical information. And so here, I'm not going to sort of walk through the details of this, but we have this notion of sort of, you know, topics of conversation you can ask about, characteristics of characters, things you can learn based on conversation topics and characteristics of characters, which, as you learn them, open possibilities for new kinds of interactions with other kinds of characters, right? So we haven't sort of like pre-scripted, you're going to hear this from this character and they're always going to stand in this location. Instead, there's sort of a possibility space that is authored, where the possibility space talks about types of characters, kinds of information, and so forth. We also, in this project, generate dialogue to match the play. And so there's dialogue generation going on where the dialogue isn't pre-scripted, but is being generated on the fly based on prior interactions the player has had and so forth. And then there's some kind of data-driven learning work that's going on to kind of say, well, God, if you're going to generate personality-rich dialogue, this is not a kind of dialogue generation that's normally done in the natural language dialogue world, right? The natural language dialogue world tends to focus on task-based interactions where you're not actually trying to convey a specific personality through the nature of the surface text. Here we are, and so then, you know, you have a natural language generator that's maybe got a lot of different knobs on it that influence generation in various ways. How do you tune those knobs so as to actually target specific styles of personality? Well, there's some learning work done on film scripts that's been done to like set those knobs. All right, and so obviously there's a lot of technical detail we could talk about in each of these pieces. But what I want to sort of come back to here is like to think about, well, how are these different disciplines relating to each other, you know, in this particular computational media project? Well, the first thing that's happening, kind of one of the easiest thing to think about, is what I would call like mainstream, you know, digital media practice, where computing becomes a practice for the arts, right? Computing, some computing technology, in this case mobile and pervasive game technology, is being used, applied to the art practice of creating a pervasive RPG. So this is, computing is a practice for the arts. This is kind of a tool use of computing for the arts. There's also kind of some mainstream digital humanities happening in this project, to the degree digital humanities can be considered mainstream already. But what I mean by mainstream here is, again, this sort of tool orientation, where in this case, statistical natural language processing is being applied to the analysis of film scripts in order to learn parameters that are related to different personalities, to learn textual parameters that are related to personalities. But this kind of taking data like from novels or film scripts and then performing some process over them to learn something or visualize something, again, would be what I would consider to be kind of standard digital humanities. We also have arts-based computing research happening here. So this is a little not as common, where the practice as game designers working on the project of trying to design a dynamic RPG that can dynamically retarget who knows what and where the characters are and so on. Doing that practice actually pushes back on computing, forcing novel computing research, in this case, to develop models of plot and character. Models of plot and character that didn't exist before, and where those models of plot and character are driven by, come out of, in this case, a game design practice of building a dynamic RPG. And so I think that's all I want to say about that one. But so this gives our sort of first example of like a concrete computational media research project, and how, as you're sort of connecting arts, humanities, and computing, 3 different ways they happen to connect in the course of that project. The next one I want to talk briefly about is Prom Week. This was an experimental game we released a couple of years ago. and got some amount of attention, was a IndieCade and IGF finalist, and et cetera, et cetera. In Prom Week, it's basically a simulation of the social machinations and manipulations of high school life. So in a sense, this is kind of like, Mean Girls, the game, right? Or, and it's set in these hallway interactions in the week leading up to the prom. And so the player is basically engaged in a process of, frankly, kind of social manipulation and brinksmanship with this cohort of high school students who are very much modeled on the sort of caricature of high school life that you would find in movies like Mean Girls. And you're trying to sort of influence the outcome of what happens at the prom through this social gameplay. So first of all, there aren't that many models. If going back to this idea of pre-scripted content and trying to move towards computational models, there aren't that many models of social interaction. If you look at like The Sims as being like a primary commercial project that has had two distinct underlying social simulations, the kind of Edith script-based one that underlined Sims 1 and 2, and then the more kind of social practices-based simulation that underlies Sims 3 and 4. And interestingly enough, that's in terms of commercial game projects, you pretty much kind of run out of steam there. It's hard to think about other games that have tried to deeply put into play the social interactions between characters. Usually that's not something that's playable. It's part of the sort of pre-scripted data-centric background of the game. So for Prom Week, we wanted to have kind of goal-based social interaction where the social interactions result in concrete dialogue between the characters. So The Sims is able to kind of, in a sense, it was a clever design move. They can get away with a lot through using Simlish, right? Because they don't have to worry about the sort of specificity of history. So we wanted to have the specificity of history really impact the details of what you learn from characters, their dialogue, the kinds, we wanted to have more specificity in the kinds of social interactions characters could have with each other. And so to think about developing a new social model to put into play, we sort of turned to three major inspirations, I guess. One would be the dramaturgical analysis in the social sciences. So looking at Irving Goffman particularly, but there's sort of a bunch of people around Goffman who were kind of saying, let's look at social practices as these joint practices that people what would be the right word? Recruit each other into. That would be the right word. So in a hallway, I walk up to someone and I might be very aware of who else is watching in the hallway, and so I'm going to sort of recruit someone into a social practice so as to perform a certain aspect of maybe my personality or my power position in the organization, for both for the benefit of these third-party observers and also to try to actively change something about the social state or social relationship with the primary person I've recruited into the practice, right? And so in some sense, the Goffman-esque view, this kind of dramaturgical view of social practice is very, there is a sense of it as social practice is a giant chess game, basically, where we're recruiting each other into these practices for the purposes of manipulating and changing social state. I don't believe that is all and only what human beings do with each other, but it's a very interesting lens to take, right? And so what we want to do is sort of say, well, what if you actually computationally modeled that for the purposes of media projects, right? But we're also going to throw in sort of a healthy dose of transactional psychology. and this sort of like, 1970s transactional psych that talked about like the games people play with each other, which was another way where game in this sense kind of meant specific rituals, usually recurring rituals that I would recruit other people into, often unwillingly, so as to play out certain psychological dynamics over and over and over again, right? So it's sort of like this play out psychological dynamics by recruiting people. Manipulate social state by recruiting people. So we kind of look at that, and then what we did is we actually said, well, let's take this lens, and instead of doing the kind of participant observation that a sociologist would normally do, where I'd like kind of sit in a public space and maybe just take notes for hours, looking at the world through this lens to kind of catalog different kinds of social practices and their parts and so on. It's like, well, actually, let's look at movies and television shows like Sex and the City and Mean Girls, where we're going to sort of use the screenwriters for those as people who have powerful implicit models of social games and social practices, but they've kind of like turned them up to 11, right, compared to the density of them you would see in the real world. And let's catalog those from the point of view of these two lenses, and then build a computational model of them. And so that's what we did to support Prom Week. And I'm not going to walk through the details of this computational model, but it's a sort of relatively complex AI model that's, in a sense, kind of an implementation of Goffman-esque social practices to support the kind of social practices you see in screenwriting, between characters and screenwriting. And then we use that to then build Prom Week as an instance. There's other projects we've done. Like here we see a project that's actually about cross-cultural training in the situation where you're coming up to groups of people, you don't share a language at all, there might be a potentially heated situation, and you're having to sort of by hook or by crook figure out how to not step on cultural landmines, not make a jerk of yourself, not escalate things, and kind of suss out what's going on, right? That's the, and this is a project called Immerse that actually Karen, who's here, or Karen Tannenbaum, who's here, works on as a research scientist, that is sort of building on that underlying SIF model we developed for Prom Week, but extending it for real-time embodied interaction, both on the parts of characters, where real-time embodied performance adds a lot of complexity and constraints to the kind of simplified performances of Prom Week, and also interpreting whole-bodied real-time performance on the part of players. So their gestures, their facial expressions, utterances, so forth. So if we look at this project through these lenses, we see a couple new relationships that I'll call Humanities-Inspired Computing, where in this case, some aspect of the humanities, in this case Goffman's model of social practices, becomes a subject for computational modeling, right? So computer science generally tends to turn to the sciences for its subjects to computationally model, but why not turn to the humanities for your subjects to computationally model, right? I would just as be, I personally am interested in modeling things like Hegel's model of history. I want a computational model of that's playable. There's like once you open that door, there's a couple thousand years worth of interesting theorizing that's like fair game for computationally modeling for the purpose of supporting new kinds of interactive experiences. There's art-inspired computing in this case. So before, the links you might have noticed in the previous one were all practice links, like something was being used as a practice for something else. Here I'm showing sort of subject links, where in this case, first humanities as subject for computing. Here we have sort of art. In this case, we're looking a lot at dramaturgy and sort of dramatic storytelling from theater, and saying, how do we build models that support believability, in the sense that theater people talk about believability based on theories of believability that have been developed in drama. I think the last, There's two more examples I have. I'm going to skip one, and I'm just going to give one more that's not vaguely game-related at all, just to sort of show other examples of computational media besides games that still have this kind of computational modeling going on. So I'm going to talk briefly about a system called Tableau Machine. It was actually in a show at the Beale here in 2007-ish, and was up for like several months at the Beale, so you might have run into this beast. Though it was not intended for galleries, it was intended for homes. So it's real situatedness is some studies we ran where we had it set up in people's homes for a period of several months, and then we're doing sort of longitudinal ethnographic studies of people living with this thing over time. So the goal of Tableau Machine is to basically say, well, let's take art generation. You know, people have been doing, have been developing various forms of algorithmic visual art for years, and there's sort of a rich and, you know, complex field you can read about algorithmic visual art. But almost every algorithmic visual art generator that you can find kind of generates visual representations in darkness, right? Kind of brain in a vat models, where it just sits there and sort of fueled by a lot of random number generation, generates visual compositions, but they're not in response to anything in the world. They're not, it's not a commentary on anything in the world, which as a sort of model of visual art practice is kind of interesting, right? It would be like visual artists kind of like lock themselves in closets and put, cover their ears and cover their eyes and then sort of like blindly like make visual compositions. Well, no, they're actually like looking at the world around them and responding to it. So this was sort of an experiment in, well, what would it mean to build that kind of an artist where what the artist is visually responding to is the dynamics, the kind of interpersonal and social dynamics of a household over time. And so Tableau Machine is a distributed vision system that's sort of, that's tracking activity in a home and pulling out a number of abstract measures of activity that we call energy, density, and flow. And I can talk more offline about what we meant by energy, density, and flow. But those measures of activity, both on a sort of regional basis within the home and on a global basis, then are sort of commented on by the visual art generator, which we kind of see something over here in the corner. And it kind of makes, it's kind of like 2D composition 101 or something like that. It's, vaguely reminiscent of Russian constructivism, though we weren't trying to like copy Russian constructivism. I think of it more as like a freshman art student in their introductory 2D composition class, and you're basically told, make abstract 2D compositions that respond to this social activity, that somehow comment on the social activity. That's what we did with Tableau Machine. And there were sort of kind of two critiques we were engaging here. One was in UBComp, one was about UBComp and one was about InfoViz. UBComp often, ubiquitous computing, often starts with this presupposition that the goal is to sense and model human context as well or better than humans can model human context, so as to automatically take appropriate action. This is like the system that knows what you want before you know what you want it, before you know what you want, and so sort of proactively jumps in. InfoViz is often predicated on kind of an unproblematic reading of an explicit rendering of objective state. That, that somehow there's like a decoding, an explicit decoding, like, information has been put into the visualization, people extract information out of the visualization, and it's sort of a one-to-one reading and kind of encoding, decoding problem. And there are already a sort of a set of theoretical debates in the history of AI that have critiqued these assumptions within AI, like AI research in the 90s. There were raging debates that were basically about the AI version of these two assumptions, right? And embodied AI was actually a reaction to these assumptions in an AI context. So we were kind of looking at it and saying, well, what can we do that's sort of different with UBComp and InfoViz? Where the goal of ubiquitous computing in this case is not to sort of sense and model human context as well or better than a human could, but to be an alien presence. Like let's build a system that has an alien interpretation of human context. and then comments on that alien interpretation, not by giving explicit information visualizations that you can read an unproblematic objective understanding of the state from, but rather they're commentaries that are kind of mysterious, that you have to decode, but that are not, but that do have more in them than just like what you would get from random number generation, right? Like humans are very good at projecting meaning on almost anything you give them. So we want to beat that. We want to basically build something that we call co-interpretation. The system's doing some interpretation, the humans are doing some interpretation, and together those two are converging on something richer and more meaningful than if the humans were doing all the projection. And I can talk to you about our evaluation studies afterwards, but the answer is yes, we achieve that. That is possible. So yeah, I'm not going to, we have that Tableau machine architecture, but what I want to jump to there is, given this background, there's a couple of other relationships between disciplines that are starting to be investigated here. Here we have computing, UBComp and InfoVis in particular, becoming a subject for the humanities. In this case, kind of a rich and robust critique of representation that already took place in AI in the 90s and is beginning to take place, but not very robustly, in ubiquitous computing and information visualization. So this is what software studies is. Software studies is basically exactly about sort of humanistic critiques and interpretations of computational processes and algorithms. There's also critical technical practice happening. In critical technical practice, and taking this term explicitly from Avery and his book, the humanities becomes a practice for computing. So that's a different thing. So in this case, like asking and answering humanistic questions, and the way you do that as a humanities scholar, we're going to do that over here, right? So you can sort of think of this as like, I'm going to read, like as a humanities scholar, if I was engaged in critiques of representation, I would engage in a lot of reading and writing of texts to engage in that critique. Here, I want to, when you import that, in a sense, as a practice into computing, you also engage in a lot of reading and writing of code in order to perform that same critique. In this case, resulting in alternative models, executable alternative models of meaning making. So I'm going to skip this last example and just come to this picture. So another way of looking at computational media. So we talked about how it takes the computational model as the message, right? That's kind of that's the position. And then if you buy that, then we start, so now we're fundamentally talking about meaning, right? We're talking about computational modeling as a carrier of meaning. If we look at this collection of fields, which have also had a long and storied engagement with meaning, these are the relationships that end up existing between those fields in terms of fields being subjects for each other and practices for each other, which I hope I've demonstrated that there's a much richer set of those possible relationships than the ones investigated by the computer as tool model, which in the kind of classical digital humanities, the computer was a tool for, say, doing corpus analysis and answering humanistic questions. In a lot of computer-based forms of interactive art, the computer is a tool, for making my interactive art. Okay, well that's, those are two of these practice arrows on this diagram, but there's so many others, plus all the subject arrows. So sort of doing all of these across and within multiple projects is also what computational media is about. And so with that, I think I will close. Thanks.
Plenty of time for questions.
Which, if people want to be more informal, I'd be happy to go outside too. But... Yes?
Hi. Excellent talk. So you said in the School of Engineering, okay?
Yeah.
So is engineering another one of these things, or do you kind of have to be covert, because as you said in your introduction, sort of, if your colleagues in the school are chemical engineers or electrical engineers, they may not a priori be comfortable with, sort of a humanistic reflection on their practice. Dare they even think such one might exist? So how does your situation within the School of Engineering?
Well, it's one of the reasons why we're in our own department within the School of Engineering, right? Like, why have a computational media department? Like, the traditional answer to interdisciplinarity in the university is to say, we're going to have these very disciplinary departments, and then everyone doing interdisciplinary work is going to be kind of a freak on the fringe, and they get to do some interdisciplinary work on the fringe, but not much before tenure. They have to kind of pretend to, like, salute the flag a lot in their discipline before tenure, and then after tenure, maybe they get to do more, right? So the goal in computational media is to say, those people that are on the fringes, they're the core of this new department. And I've had the experience, I've seen this play out at multiple universities, both kind of from personal experience and from friends, where attempts to do this kind of thing across the departmental structure of universities, there's a tendency to fail because resources flow to departments. Resources don't flow to interdisciplinary programs. And faculty who are in interdisciplinary programs, well, they're not in the program, they're in the department. So in a bunch of distinctly disciplinary departments. And so the disciplinary departments, kind of say, like, thou shalt, like, discipline. They have to maintain the discipline of their disciplinary departments, and there's not a built-in resource flow structurally to supporting that kind of interdisciplinary work. And so the play, I guess, that we're doing at Santa Cruz is to say, well, let's make a department whose job is this, right? Which is kind of, it feels weird. It's sort of like, well, aren't you just, are you just like reifying this into some new discipline? And that, and maybe 20 years from now we'll have to worry about that. We certainly don't have to worry about it now, because we're still, at this point, there's no sense of having like hardened into a particular set of practices or norms. But I think, I'm not quite sure if this answered your question, but it was to, basically, people doing this, I want them to have a first-class home, not to be second-class citizens in other people's first-class homes.
Can I quickly follow up on that with the footnote? So you focus on the research design and on the impulses and bring this together as a department, and you're giving Walt a very pragmatic answer that's also research-oriented.
Yes.
As we know, a department is also organized around curriculum, and you haven't really touched on curriculum. Can you say something about that? Mostly universities are very conservative in creating new curriculum, because it's one thing, it's welcome and encouraged to fail in your research. It's quite another and discouraged to fail in teaching. So if you're going to have a new degree, that's the reason we have departments, as hidebound as they are. You have a unit that can be redundant and disciplined in delivering a certain curriculum that's defined.
Right.
Do you have like 100 more slides on curriculum, or is that something that takes a second fiddle in your conversation?
No, it doesn't. So I don't have 100 slides prepared, but I can certainly talk about it. So at the undergraduate level, like, in a sense, we've already got the BS in computer games, right, in computer game design. And that, students are required to take classes in a number of departments. So that's one way you do that, is you kind of say, for the computer game design, the BS computer game design students, who are that sort of technically oriented game folk, they're taking classes in computer science, they're taking classes in computational media, they're taking classes in art, they're taking classes in film and digital media, etc. So, I guess an answer to your question would be that for that subset, so part of their education, not all of it, but part of it is delivered by instructors whose primary focus is games and playable media. right? So the computational media department actually offers a principal home for those people, because oftentimes in universities, games-oriented folk are an example of these people who sit on the fringes of computing or the fringes of art or the fringes of, so they happen to be core members of computational media, but for students in a curriculum, well, the curriculum is actually, the classes in the curriculum are provided by multiple departments. So I guess one answer to the question is, curricula are in some sense orthogonal to departments, but for certain kinds of curricula, you need certain kinds of faculty on campus who are the kinds of faculty that normally would not have natural homes. So that's one answer. At the graduate level, I mean, this is why we're putting in a proposal for a PhD in computational media and an MS in computational media, is sort of this kind of practice to engage in the kinds of projects that I gave examples of. We want to let people be able to study that as a first-class graduate degree. And there isn't sort of a place to do that now. From a job placement perspective, I mean, I imagine one comeback would be, well, these students are going to have to go out into a job market where most universities are going to have the traditional disciplinary silos, so maybe they can't be hired anywhere, right? That would be a concern. I guess my comeback would be like just looking at it from a market research perspective. Over the last 5 years or so, I have observed a number of departments, both on the art side of the house and the computing side of the house, that have had job ads out specifically looking for a bridge person, like a computing person who bridges to arts, or an arts person who bridges to computing. And I've observed many of those searches fail. Like, I've actually seen that, like, you know, there are a bunch of universities, I've seen those kind of job ads in the last 5 years, and I would say, anecdotally, just from talking to people at these universities and so on, maybe half to 2/3 of those searches fail because they couldn't actually find someone who's kind of genuinely doing both, right? And so, you know, from a market research perspective, it's like, well, a computational media PhD graduate is genuinely doing both. They genuinely have, you know, circulated around this graph through multiple relationships of subject and practice between these disciplines in a way that someone getting either an MFA or a CS PhD isn't able to, right? So I sort of feel like, I guess optimistically, I feel like the time is right, that the universe wants more people who are doing this. And frankly, I would hope that over time, other universities will have computational media departments, right? Or departments that are the intellectual peer, even if they're not called engaged in similar kind of thing. So I don't, if that, so I guess that would be my curriculum.
The only problem there would be the tenure process. People sort of are across the two boundaries. I mean, where would they be publishing and how would they be evaluated by their peers in those? I mean, you tend to see that sometimes, that if they're in computer science, how would the art side of it be judged, or how would they, if they're engaged in that, how does it happen? And, secondary appointments or joint appointments often are very difficult for junior faculty. So.
And so I guess that would be a challenge for comp media, is that we want, instead of the person having a primary and secondary appointment, they're 100% in comp media, and let's say theoretically they're doing a mixture of art shows, single author monographs and papers. Well, we know how to judge them.
Yes, but if they would go somewhere else, that's what I meant. You're saying you see these jobs advertised, and the reason why there's a problem is because I mean, we're always still stuck with the fairly antiquated.
I see what you're saying.
That's what
I'm saying. And so I guess
that's what I'm saying. It could be for somebody graduating that it might be a bit of a.
So I guess that suggests that.
No, I think it's a brilliant idea. I'm just saying is that looking into the future, yes, if the tenure process will change.
Well, what that suggests to me in the PhD curriculum, actually it gives me a good idea that I'm going to put in our proposal, is kind of a boot camp sort of class their last couple of years before they graduate, which is like, you've lived in this lovely interdisciplinary fairyland. Like, here's, let's do like simulated brutal mock job interviews from a computing department, from an arts department, from a digital media department, and that, because my goal would be that these students would be able to, like, fully authenticate in any of those departments. I mean, it might be, I know when I was at Georgia Tech, I was cross-appointed between literature, communication, and culture in the College of Computing, and the way, yeah, I don't know, so at the danger of this possibly not being sustainable, but the way I played that position is I played it such that if you stripped out everything computer science publication related that I was doing and just looked at my art practice and media practice, it was tenurable in LCC, and vice versa. If you stripped all that out and just looked at my computing publications, I was tenurable in the College of Computing. So that's how I played it when I was in a similar thing. It does sort of mean that theoretically you have 2 jobs, maybe, I don't know. But I guess I hope that our future graduates are the same. You know, maybe that's too tall an order. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm kind of interested in the connections between the institute trained PhD or BA student and eventually to contribute to the game industry. What is the connection here is because I think when I look at the job descriptions, they hire particularly like a concept artist and also the computer model designers. And so yours is kind of like the combination of these 2 fields. So then your future graduate student, when they, what kind of the job market they're looking for your students?
Yeah, so a couple, I hopped over to this one for that. So I'm going to focus on the undergrads and the professional masters, I think, because for like the PhD students, basically they've got academic jobs open to them. I've also placed students in the games industry with PhDs, but it's because the game industry, you know, because some particular studio wanted exactly what the student was doing for their dissertation. So it's a very different, I mean, PhD preparation is individualized enough that it's hard to say something general about that for industry, and I certainly, basically PhDs aren't about industry, right? In some sense, or PhDs are about the discovery of, you know, the discovery / invention of fundamentally new knowledge, which may or may not be of interest to particular companies and may or may not be of interest to particular departments that are recruiting people. So it's not, but the focus is not on, yeah, so I'll just leave it at that. Certainly for these people, the BA and these people, job placement is very important, right? So for the BS folks, we're actually changing the name. It's going to be Bachelor of Science in Games and Playable Media, because the game design thing is a little bit of a misnomer. These really are game engineers who are design sensitive, for lack of a better term. They have taken a number of design-oriented classes. They have participated in interdisciplinary teams. Some of them are amazing designers, right? But it's not that our program made them amazing designers. Basically, our program doesn't guarantee everyone's an amazing designer, but some people are because of who they are and their life experience when they came in and so on. But it does guarantee that everyone has a certain level of technical competence and background in implementing games and game-like experiences. And so we're basically placing people as engineers out of this. Or many of them are like trying to make a go of it as doing indie game studios too.
Is that because you have the new BA coming on and you want the design to move over there, or?
Design, well, it's because we didn't want this to be like 50% design, 50% engineering, because then they're neither fish nor fowl, right? And so we want this one to skew engineering, and this one skews design. This one is much bigger, and will be much bigger than this one, because if we were producing, say, 100, 150 graduates a year in game design per se, that is not something that people can realistically find work doing. So you also have to be sort of fair. You have to be cognizant of the fact that like the games industry has far fewer positions for either engineers or designers, but particularly for designers, to place people in than the sum total of all the people being produced by game programs, right? Like right now, games programs are like grossly overproducing people who can actually get jobs in the games industry. So what that also means from a sort of game or job placement perspective and being kind of a responsible university citizen is that we want to make sure these people are prepared to do other things besides work in the game industry. Like I feel like these people, one way I describe it is, if I look at, the computation is the model supporting a form of kind of like radically interactive computing. Well, there's lots of places where radically interactive computing is a necessary and useful and powerful skill besides games, right? And so many of our majors at this level, there's lots of different things they can do, one of which is work in the game industry. For example, the year-long studio capstone course, which I know you guys have a similar like capstone thing, that is an experience that like traditional computer science majors don't get. They might take a software engineering course where they have to like work in teams for a semester or something, but this sort of like working over an entire year in an interdisciplinary team with all the sort of foibles and failure modes of that kind of team has given them an understanding of the workplace and the human interaction aspect of large projects that most bachelor students would not have, that they would have to learn on the job the hard way when frankly the stakes are a lot higher, right? And universities should be places where it's safe to fail, right? And then you can learn from that failure. And so I think that kind of really intensive interdisciplinary team capstone work is something that gives these students a real leg up, because almost anything you're going to do in computing, in industry, is going to involve that kind of teamwork. And then these folks, this is a pretty hand-picked group of students who come in every year. The GPM, the professional masters, they're paying professional fees, right? So it's an expensive degree. And frankly, the Romeros, who basically know everybody in the industry, help hand place those students. So this is sort of that's kind of what professional programs are supposed to be, is that you get into them, it's a relatively small group, and you're taught by people who have the connections to basically hand place you afterwards. So that's the answer there, I guess.
Is the focus of that one more on design?
No, this is, it's a mixture. So both John and Brenda are really strong believers in the fact that the best game designers also know how to program and how to implement, right? That's their kind of personal philosophy.
Sort of similar,
And
yeah.
so it's similar to this one, though it's, the way I think about this one, like any kind of professional program, is kind of, in a sense, like a really intense finishing school, where skills that you developed from in a program like this, for example, or the program here at Irvine, get polished to a fine sheen, and then you've got like a huge leg up, having had that experience, plus working with people of the level of the stature within the industry, the people teaching it, to then get a job. Yeah.
Oh, that was a great talk. I might just switch focus a little bit.
Okay.
Just to ask a question about the system that was created for the Prom. What is it?
Prom week, yeah.
Yeah, Prom week. I was interested in if because the critical engineering part or the critical technical kind of knowledge,
Yeah.
You're making an argument or claim that instead of writing a monograph, for example, about Goffman, right?
Right.
Perhaps we'll create a system about social interaction, right?
Right.
Now, the question would be like, are you just modeling Goffman or taking these ideas and trying to use it within a system? Like, here's Goffman's theory with a little mixed in of Mean Girls and something else.
Right.
Or are the people in creating that system, are they actually making discoveries about Goffman's theory of social interaction? Are they actually implementing critical differences that might critique his structures of social, whatever that might be? I'm not
So in the case of the common flow architecture, this architecture in particular, this was not focused so much on that critical investigation of Goffman, but you could totally, like the project you're talking about would be a totally interesting and valid project to do that might end up in a different architecture. Like this, we did not engage in the reflective critical technical practice loop of then reading this to comment back on Goffman to then make an intervention and so on. There's the example I skipped, which is this thing called Gammamatic, which is a kind of a game generator for generating news games, editorial games, which are kind of the game equivalent of editorial cartoons. But so there's this thing called procedural rhetoric that Ian Bogo certainly talks about in Persuasive Games, and that Mike Trainer and I have talked about in a number of papers. And procedural rhetoric is basically the claim that there exists a set of just like in classic rhetoric, you're basically learning tropes and techniques for persuasion. Procedural rhetoric sort of claims that there exists a set of tropes and techniques for persuasion through processes, through algorithmic processes. And then various people have theorized in print about like what those tropes might look like, how they function, often by looking at examples of games that claim to try to persuade or influence, and then say like, well, how are their game mechanics doing that? Well, I would claim that this is also an argument about procedural rhetoric. Here, this is just a random slab of code from Gammamatic. But Gammamatic, as a game generator, literally has an AI model, a set of commitments to these tropes for procedural persuasion. And there are these things we call micro-rhetorics, and micro-rhetorics have this very specific structure and so on. And so in this case, we do claim to be making first-class contributions to the theory of procedural rhetoric by being forced to ground it out all the way down. There's something like when you write code as a form of kind of humanistic interrogation, one of the ways in which that's helpful is that there's nowhere to kind of sweep things under the rug. It's like a lot harder to sweep things under the rug. I can't sort of fool myself with a clever like turn of phrase, or like Dan Dennett talks about this as like his view of AI as thought experiments, and he sort of said that you can view a lot of classical AI systems as basically thought experiments about the nature of intelligence, but compared to philosophical thought experiments that philosophers engage in, philosophers are, and these are his words, somewhat pointedly, rarely surprised by the outcome of their thought experiment, where AI researchers frequently are, right? So there's something about performing thought experiments in code that there's kind of an externalization or objectification that happens, and also sort of a grounding out of every detail that both reveals holes, lacunae in the theory, because you find yourself having to fill things in ad hoc, because the theory just doesn't really say what to do concretely right here. And then when you actually execute this thing, it often like does crazy stuff where you're like, God, this, in the case of procedural rhetoric, this isn't persuasive at all, or why is it mapping this game mechanic to try and convince me of this, right? And that's, so this would be, this was the project where I was going to use this as a concrete example of computing as a practice for the humanities, where it was sort of a, in a case like building a computational model of procedural rhetoric is a way to theorize about procedural rhetoric. But in the case of Congo and the Goffman model, we could have been doing that. Like that is a thing one could do, but we didn't. We were more driven by saying if we relatively uncritically use a Goffmanesque lens and apply it to media like film and television, and then implement that, what do we get?
Is that affecting interpretation of the instance that was created by it? If there isn't that kind of deep critical thinking that's happening in the construction of the system, of the social interrelations, and then you have the instance of it, which is the game, the visual representation of the Prom thing, can that game make its own contributions to critiquing whatever it is doing about prom night, or is it dependent on that implementation? You know what I'm saying?
Certainly actually making the media pushes back hard on the underlying, on the the affordances of the underlying model. I'd say the artistic validity, but what I mean by artistic validity in this case is this a model with which you can actually build expressive and compelling media, right? And so I would say actually grounding it out and building a game and doing the extra, say, 2.5 years of work beyond what was needed just to publish the paper or publish the papers about the model. Well, it turns out we actually iterated the underlying AI model like about 3 times, but it was driven by the pushback we were getting from making media, rather than the pushback we were getting by critical reflection on the model of Goffman. You see what I'm saying? So there was iteration, but the reflection was driven by, like actually engaging in making. Like making is a form of knowledge construction as well. And so I would say that the Sith model of Goffman's dramaturgical analysis, the pushback that iterated it was making, not theoretical reflection. Does that make sense?
Totally.
Okay. Cool. Yeah.
It was very fascinating. So, although I guess we have a few more minutes, so I don't necessarily want to be the last question. But when you talked about like John and Brenda's work with board games, okay, so I want to kind of move into the space of where computation without a digital embodiment,
Right.
Because things like parlor games and board games may be are about human computation.
Yes.
Relatively here. So
right. But I'd say I would still call them process-based media. But it's not. Humans are implementing the process by moving.
Yeah, and that's kind of
cardboard around or whatever
that
on a
was
board.
Kind of maybe interested in your thoughts about what you think what kinds of things can be done there as sort of interesting or challenging problems. That is, can digitally embodied computation give new insights as to what people can do, and then conversely, what people can do, can that create new models of digital computation and the computational media sense?
Yeah, and I would say on starting with the latter, if I'm very interested in tabletop games and that, and besides just enjoying them, which is one reason I'm interested in it, and it's okay that I just enjoy playing tabletop games. But I also find it interesting that if you look at the set of themes, world themes that have been sort of rendered into playable models that board games cover, it's much, much broader than what digital games have done, right? And that's partly because I think it's possible to, because you're leveraging a lot of sophisticated nuance of sort of interpretation and decision-making on the part of the human being that you didn't have to implement, right? That's like being brought to the table. That it allows, you're able to build actionable models of, there's games about wilderness survival, and there's games, there's like almost anything you can think of. There's like a board game about it where it's not just the theme, it's not just like a static theme, but it's actually the playable model. And I think, I'm just speculating here, but I've thought a lot about this but haven't really come to a definitive conclusion, but I think it's because you're able to more quickly prototype and describe processes about non-standard themes because of the fact you're also leveraging a lot of sort of free intelligent process that's coming to you from the human who's interpreting and executing the rules. But what that means is that there's this vast sea of interesting models that people have developed in the board game world that could be further cashed out in the digital world where the implementation of that process has to go kind of further down, be more detailed than it has to be in the board game. But there's game from a interactive storytelling point in particular, I'm fascinated, or a story generation point, given your background with Meehan and everything. It's amazing to me that games like Tales of the Arabian Nights are basically a cardboard story generator. Like if you actually look at those rules and analyze it, it's like, this is a story generator, and you can like write out the process, and here's this knowledge base, which is in the form of this like giant book with like 2,000 some odd numbered paragraphs with things you turn to and condition checks on them and all that. It's like, you know, they basically implemented a story generator in cardboard and paper, which is quite useful and interesting to analyze from that perspective and think about, okay, well, if I was building a story generator in computational practice, I want to borrow from this. You know, what is this model over here in paper and cardboard getting to kind of finesse by being implemented in paper cardboard that I actually have to like, you know, like what are the holes in the paper and cardboard model I have to fill in to make it a computational process model? What can I just borrow in whole cloth? What is this model over here, the paper and cardboard one, doing that I've maybe never seen in a digital story generator? Like
Well, and then maybe also conversely, the freedom that cardboard gives you that computation doesn't.
Yeah, well, I think a part of that freedom is the rapidity of prototyping. And I actually there's a practice of, you know, so rapid prototyping is, you know, a big thing in the game industry, and I think, you know, Spore kind of put it on the map. You know, that, you know, Will Wright's famous GDC talks about this and stuff, and it's kind of become rapid prototyping, including physical prototyping, before you get to the computational prototyping for a game, is now a standard thing. Generally, the things that are prototyped are fundamental mechanics. We've done some experiments in what it means to paper prototype AI. And that's what, and so for a number of our research projects that ended up resulting in a fairly complex, you know, executable AI model at the end, there actually were several, including SIF actually, the thing underlying Prom week, there was a paper, pencil, and cardboard prototype of that AI that we spent some time doing learnings from as well. And like Miriam Eladari, who's at the University of Malta now, has also written about and done some really interesting work in sort of board game-like prototyping of AI systems. And so I think there's, in terms of just trying to understand like what do we mean when we say that cardboard design seems to offer more freedom, I think one of the things we mean is the rapidity of change. Like, you know, it's sort of like you can have an idea, you can try it out and sort of play it. You know, if I have an idea about some big AI simulation and social interaction I'm working on, you know, from idea to being able to try it out and see if that idea was good, might be like a couple weeks of work, right? That's in a cardboard system, it might be a couple hours of work. So that's really cool. I would like to get feedback. Yeah, you know, a couple hours is a lot better than a couple weeks to get feedback on the idea. So.
I thought creative coders were just supposed to get in there and hack away and innovate and produce on the fly.
Yeah, there's some of that, but there's also sometimes it depends on the complexity of what you're past certain. Partly I can tell you're sort of gently mocking the creative coding thing, but past a certain complexity threshold, there's actually you have to move to architecture, and once you're in architecture land. You need architecture in order to tame the complexity, but once you're talking about architectures rather than kind of like on the fly kind of munge code, they're also much harder to change. And like the commitments are much more time consuming to make and learn from, but it's necessary because without moving to the architectural perspective, there's no way you can tame the complexity. And so, I mean, my personal work tends to be over that threshold, where you're in sort of full-fledged kind of architecture land, just because of the complexity of the processes you're dealing with. But yes, I used to teach when I was at Tech. I taught a class called Computations and Expressive Medium, which was a first-year graduate course for the digital media students. It was basically Introduction to Computer Science for Artists and Humanists. And so it was sort of like, what if computer science was taught from the ground up, was introduced as if it was only about creative expression? You has nothing to do with employee databases and, God help you like lookups about their salary and, printing numbers between 1 and 10 and all, but it was actually like from the very first assignment about creative expression. This was sort of 2003-ish, I guess I was doing this course. And for that course, I did a lot of live programming from the class, which is cool. It's also, it's kind of fun to teach without a net like that too. It's like, oh, and then you can do this. Oh, it's not working. All right, let me show you how you debug. But I better debug it in about 30 seconds because it's going to get really boring otherwise. So, no, it's like, I thrive on pressure. And so like live coding from the class was actually something I enjoyed. But,
Well, we've even gone over our
okay,
limit,
sorry.
But
Yeah.
on the other hand, I think the questions, presentation was excellent, the Q&A was informing and illustrative. So again, I want to have everyone thank Michael for coming and giving